Hi, I'm Svenung here at APIS, and I'm proud to once again welcome you to a webinar on the topic of AI. For those who missed the first one, it is still available for free at our YouTube channel, so check it out. Today and now we're gonna have a topic on AI and ethics and all the implications that may have on so many things from the big corporations, the economics, the personal stuff, and all that. But to give you a better context of today's topic, I will actually hand it over to our guest speaker of today, Dr. Manoj Jiba. So, dear Manoj, over to you and welcome.
Perfect. Thank you, Sven, and good day to everyone, depending on which time zone you're in. It always gives me great pleasure to talk about artificial intelligence. And specifically today's topic. I think today's topic is becoming more and more important as you and I start thinking about leveraging artificial intelligence for our organization. What we know is that many companies and organizations around the world are really leveraging both artificial intelligence and its core ingredient of data to really create what we call scalable solutions. I'll just briefly start with some context, but I thought it's important to understand that from an organization's perspective, as you start creating these scalable solutions, but you're also scaling reputational, regulatory, and legal risks. Where does this all come from? This really comes from us understanding the ethics behind what we're thinking and seeing from an artificial intelligence perspective. Now, while my focus today specifically, Svenning, is really around understanding ethics and AI ethics from a business organization perspective, it permeates society. It permeates us as individuals, and it also permeates countries. We will be able to see over the next, let's call it decade, 15 years, 20 years maybe, that if we let artificial intelligence just do what we've always done, this will have huge, huge, huge ramifications for societies and countries. I'm convinced that as we start thinking about the fourth industrial revolution, this place that we're in right now, and some people have been telling me about the fifth industrial revolution, one of the things that we often don't think about is the implications. And what have we learned from the first industrial revolution, the second and the third specifically, if we strongly believe that we're sitting in the fourth industrial revolution? And what lessons can we learn? Because we don't want to make the same mistakes again. And one of the most critical lessons that we learned from the first, second, and third industrial revolutions was really around how do we start thinking about the regulatory, the legal, and more specifically, the underlying philosophy, the ethical implications of some of our decisions as we start looking and leveraging, whatever drives those revolutions. If I just think back to the third industrial revolution, depending on where you're sitting in the world, it was really about the internet and the internet that democratized connectivity. You and I, as an example, are being able to connect right now because of the internet. Yet, if we think about the fact that we're out of the third industrial revolution and into the fourth industrial revolution, half of the world, literally half of the world, does not have access to the internet. And so we've got to start thinking about what happens between those that have and those that do not have. And this is where today's talk is really centered on. Really about setting an understanding of what are some of the AI or the ethical AI questions that we need to start thinking about. But before I get into the depths of it, what I think is really important is for us to set some context. Now, one of the things, and this is something I keep mentioning, is let's talk about this, and I want to put some visuals up this time, because it anchors us. It gives us all an opportunity not just to listen, but to see, using two of our senses that are really important as we start absorbing what I'm trying to say here. Do I have all the answers, Fenning? No. What I do have, though, is a set of sharp pencils. As you and I have been discussing, I get the opportunity to think. I get the opportunity, and I'm very fortunate in that perspective. I get the opportunity to engage with both organizations, business, government, society, any level that you want to think about, at a very personal level, and gives me the ability to think, the ability to formulate different views. And I think that's critical. But let me start with the context today. And the first context that I want to just draw us back to is what is artificial intelligence? Because as we spoke about in our first webinar, it's important for us to please get back onto what I call a level playing field. It's understanding that AI is an information system that is really just inspired by the biological system. The way we think about how the brain works, as an example, how our bodies work. As you and I still think about different stages of where we are from a vaccination perspective around COVID-19, what impact did COVID as the virus, the coronavirus itself, have on our bodies? So think about the biological system. As I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you right now, is that I don't think about breathing. It happens autonomously because I've been wired in a specific way. But what it really boils down to is the aim. And in our context here, the aim of artificial intelligence for business and organizations specifically is to improve business efficiency and/or effectiveness. So when we think about business, the real reason that we leverage technologies and technologies such as artificial intelligence is really to help us gain some efficiency gains. Because we know that when we pull the lever of efficiency in business, it has a real impact on our bottom line. That efficiency gain is also largely done through scalable solutions. And when we look at these scalable solutions specifically, is we've got to think back to what I opened up with. Is as we think about these scalable solutions, so do the other levers of legal, regulatory, and ethical that we often forget about. We get focused on the bottom line. We get focused on machine learning, neural networks, big data, speech processing, and many more other terms that we keep throwing around. But if we still think about artificial intelligence just as what it is, it's simply an umbrella term. It's a catchphrase. It's two words that really incorporate everything that we know around machine learning, natural language processing, expert systems, speech recognition, vision, planning, robotics, everything. And I'll talk about a bit about robotics today as an example of when we can get this ethics wrong, unfortunately. Or the AI, should I say more pertinently, when we get it wrong. So just to set the scene, this is what artificial intelligence is with the aim of improving business efficiency and/or effectiveness. The way we see this really popping up and affecting and impacting each and every one of us is that we're seeing there's a rapid rise, specifically in the amount of revenue that can be generated from artificial intelligence. And let's just bucket it as a technology, leveraging machine learning, neural networks, and all the other words that I mentioned. We're seeing a massive rise in its market capitalization or market revenue. And it's one of those technologies, very simply, is that many small organizations, as well as big organizations, and everyone in between, to a large extent, is looking to. And we see this rapid rise, and I'm not just pulling this up to show you, but setting the context that this is something we cannot ignore. Artificial intelligence, for everyone who's listening, is that we cannot ignore this. And when we think about not ignoring it, we can see that this is going to capture the world, it's going to capture businesses. Is that with that rapid rise comes implications that we must start thinking about first. Aren't like the first, second, and third industrial revolution, where those that have it benefited. In this case, what we will see is that if we don't think about the ethics up front and create a more harmonious way of thinking about it in our organizations, is that could be the detriment even to those organizations that do have. Because remember, we all work in an ecosystem. So we've seen this rapid rise, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. And we can see projected that this growth is going to continue from a market revenue perspective. But what's more important for me is this slide here. Because often what we don't see or don't talk about is what drives these engines. The engines is really being driven, from a small startup phase. If we think about startup organizations in the space of artificial intelligence, what we shouldn't forget about is this whole notion about who's really seed funding it. And so when we start looking at funding of AI startups, what we've seen up to 2019, as it shows on this graph here, is that about just over 2,200 deals were done with investments into AI companies. And we know that venture capitalists, funders, investors often look at things such as that will have the biggest impact. What will give them the most return for their money? And we can see that the AI market is really starting to ramp this up. And then the number in value for 2020, we saw this jump from 2,235 all the way above 2,900, with a value sitting at around $36.8 billion US. So there's a huge focus from a financial perspective, cash, funding, whether that be in terms of any instruments, debt, equity, but there's funding going to AI startups. And this means that the AI world is going to continually on its rapid rise, continue on that rapid rise, but specifically to understand why. And then when we start thinking about this here, there's a word that we often talk about in the startup world, and that's the word called the unicorn. So those unicorns with a $1 billion, if I can call it a $1 billion valuation. So what we're starting to see is that the unicorn club, specifically those organizations that have got a $1 billion market valuation, is that the number of AI startups reaching that 1 billion valuation for the first time is rapidly rising. And those valuations are primarily based on the impact that it can have and what it can provide to organizations. And what we're starting to see is this rising quite rapidly. And so we see this growing increasingly, and it's getting more and more crowded. And so I often joke around and say the Unicorn Club is going to have to move, to maybe the $1 trillion mark to keep it really, very interesting for people, and also that you know who you're talking about. But the reality of the matter and the point that I'm making here is that it's really growing. And this is going to continue. A few years ago, let's call it maybe a decade ago, there were very few companies with a $1 billion valuation from a startup perspective. Yes, there were the big companies that we all know about, your Amazons, your Amazons, your Microsofts that were there, your big tech companies, your Apples that were really, knocking on the $1 billion valuation. These are small startup companies. And so these organizations fundamentally have an ability to change the way you and I work and the impact that it has on our organizations. So this context for me is really important to set up front, because if we don't understand what we're dealing with and what's really driving it, what are those levers that we need to start pulling, is that we start forgetting about the impact that it has for businesses and organizations. And then more pertinently to what we're talking about here, the ethics. How do we start thinking about the implications as these numbers of startups grow? And what we'll start seeing is ethical AI startups also coming up to the fore. But what does it really mean? Why should we start thinking about ethics now instead of later? This has seen a massive rise, specifically from conversations, and all we've been having is many conversations around this here specifically. We see that AI will affect workforces over the next 5 years. We can see that at an organizational level, each and every one of us is going to be affected in some shape or form. So, existing workers will need to change their skill sets. Now, I want to be very clear here, is that AI is not going to replace our entire job. It will replace some components of our jobs. Now, we can view that from two different lenses. The first is that it's good. For me specifically, if I use myself as an example, I think it's a good thing. There's certain parts of my job and my daily activities which are low value adding and really what I call administrative tasks, which I don't personally like. And if those could be automated, it frees up time for me to do more value-adding activities. And so what we're seeing from an AI perspective is that it is taking away time-consuming tasks. And what it's really giving us back is that gift of time. And as I'm demonstrating here, that the second biggest lever that we're seeing is this notion of productivity, is that our organization's productivity will increase because of artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this here, but what it really is showing and demonstrating is that AI will affect workforces in the next 5 years. And that's something that we must all be very clear about. So it's time that we start thinking that if it's going to affect you and I individually as employees of organizations or individuals that contribute to organizations, we need to start thinking about the ethics and the ethical implications of that as well. AI is ubiquitous across the organization, independent of whichever vertical or division you look at and work within, independent of the industry. In some shape or form, AI is going to affect you. And this is why I keep saying is that what we don't understand is that it may not be in my industry or in my specific division. If I think about automotive and assembly as an example, and I work in risk, AI is not there yet. That does not mean that it will not affect me. And so we must stop with this thinking that, it's not going to happen to me. The one thing that I've learned in life specifically is that as soon as we say, I'm not going to be affected by it, then that's when it's going to affect you. So what am I trying to say here? is that artificial intelligence is going to affect all businesses irrespective of where you work and in which division and the type of work that you do. So what we've got to start understanding is the ethics around this here. And what is really the problem that sits from an ethical perspective? Now, we can sit and we can have some really long discussions philosophically, specifically around what is ethics, what is morality, how do we bring them together, how do we let machines do what humans used to do we put up barriers, do we stop this from happening? The first point I want to make is the last point I make, is we are not going to stop this from happening. Organizations are going to critically be pulling this artificial intelligence lever to gain efficiency, effectiveness, and then we saw, as I showed you earlier, productivity, the increase in productivity. So what we've got to start thinking about is, what does this all mean from an ethics perspective? Now, if I take you to my first slide that I showed you, specifically around what is artificial intelligence, it's an umbrella term that is really made up of machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, all of the nice big data words that we keep hearing about. At the core of this, ladies and gentlemen, at the core of this is data. And so what drives this AI is all about the data that we feed into, let's call it these machines, as we start programming them, either from a supervised perspective or an unsupervised perspective. Now, one of the biggest problems with that is that it depends on what data we feed these machines that we are programming it. Let's be clear. Each and every one of us on this call has some bias, because unfortunately, we are bounded in what I call our rationality. In other words, we can't take in every input. So if I'm sitting there programming the AI to do something, supervised or unsupervised learning, I, as a human, decide I want to take that data source in and the other data source, but I'm going to ignore another data source for some odd reason, whatever it may be. So the point is that I determine the data on which something, the artificial intelligence, gets trained on. It's exactly the same as when you go to school. The teachers, to a large extent, really determine what you and I learn. And the fact is, when you and I are learning, that's the inputs that we take. So if we've got garbage that we are learning, garbage that we're putting into our AI algorithms as an example, what do we expect is garbage out? And I think that basic principle still exists. But the real thing here is that it's all got to do with the data. The type of data that we really start collecting and then start feeding into our AI machines specifically. So just moving one step ahead, because I think this saying specifically by Ede Morse is really a critical one, which quite simply states, when we feed machines data, it reflects the history of our own unequal society. We're asking the program to learn our own biases. I think this is probably the best quote that we can find from an understanding perspective of AI ethics. So we must understand, and like I said, each and every one of us are biased, is that when we make decisions on behalf of the organizations that which we lead, is that what we're doing is that it's reflecting our biases in the way that we start coming in there. There's a nice term called the unconscious bias. You and I don't know what we don't know, and that's just the reality. But when we're building these AI machines specifically, we are imparting our thinking, our learning, and specifically what I often say, our biases onto these machines and the data that we're feeding it. Because I like A and I don't like B, I'll rather feed A instead of B. I keep forgetting as a human that what I'm trying to really achieve, specifically from an AI perspective, is an understanding of what's really happening out there. So the point that this quote for me really indicates is that when we feed machines data, we must be clear, is that that data is historic. And it depends specifically on how that data was generated. We often look at different organizations, and if I put up some here specifically, is that we're starting to see what we call bias in the data and the algorithms. We've seen from big tech companies, specifically organizations such as Amazon, their hiring tool as an example. So when they were doing this here, what Amazon found is that when they use the artificial intelligence to be able to do the recruitment, what they really found was that it was biased against females. Now, let's be clear, and I hate to be the one to have to call this out in such a public space, but one of the biggest problems is that all the AI did is that it learned from the data that it was fed. What was the data that it was fed? Is that there was always an unconscious bias that we always favored males over females, as an example, when we were recruiting them in the technology space. What AI did is highlight these biases. It was easy. If I had built it easy, it's the AI's fault. Without us really trying to understand that it's not the AI's fault. What it really, really boils down to is a clear understanding for us specifically. It's the data that we fed. It's looking at us, you and me, in a mirror, where we had this fictitious imagination in our minds that we were doing the right thing. When it's played back to us, what we start seeing specifically is that this is not what's happening. We've seen this happening to many organizations. To some extent, it happened to Microsoft's Tay, which was really built on the chatbot. Really, it said the basic premise was let the public feed the chatbot information, and that chatbot will learn from the information that the public was really giving it. And it was a way of crowdsourcing information and common questions, to be honest. Unfortunately, there was a portion of society that instead of feeding it genuine questions, real questions, as I would like to say, is that they decided to feed it racist comments, as an example, politically incorrect comments, as another example. And what it did is that it learned that. Because of the data that it was fed and it was learned, it thought this is the right thing. So let's just think about this. As a machine, you feed me A, I look for the patterns and the trends in A, I pick up that it's A, and therefore I play back. In other words, I'm simply confirming from the data what you wanted and what you always had. So what we've seen is that bias in data can have potentially devastating social repercussions. When human predilections, conscious or not, the unconscious bias that you and I really walk around with, are brought to bear in choosing which data points to use and which ones to disregard. We make those choices, ladies and gentlemen. You and I, when we sit down to program the AI, we feed it the data, we make those choices. So when the processes and frequency of data and collection itself are uneven across groups and observed behaviors, it's easy for problems to arise in how algorithms analyze, learn, and make those predictions. It's not the algorithm. It's the data that we've been feeding into these algorithms. Negative consequences, like I mentioned, Amazon, recruiting decisions. Imagine fixing and putting through, or not fixing, but rather feeding data that leads to incorrect medical or scientific prognosis and letting the AI run with it. You'll be missing, and in other words, affecting many people's lives in a space of life or death. Very similar to recruiting decisions. By not employing someone, that could have even disastrous effects on the individual and your organization. But also distorted financial models, the way we've always been thinking about them, and even criminal justice decisions. So there's huge implications based on the data that we've got to start pulling into this here. We're starting to see a huge bias based on how we train these models. In many cases, these biases really go unrecognized. Let me be clear, is that often when you and I interact, and many of us will on this call or in this webinar, apologies, is that what we often see is that if we go online shopping, there's a recommendation engine. That recommendation engine is built on me buying things based on what I bought previously. In other words, instead of really opening our world to what may be out there, what it's doing is forcing me down a funnel to some extent. There's nuances that come through that, and then those recommendation engines quite simply start learning. And they're saying, Minaj likes a blue shirt and a black pants as an example. And what does that mean? It will only start feeding me that information because that's what it assumes I will always like, and that's what I want. Now, what does this really mean? Is that in that simple example, recommendation engines can also be biased. But yet we've left that for a very long time until it personally affected us when we were looking at facial recognition as an example. And it couldn't, as in my case here, really pick up that a darker skinned individual as an example. And that's when we started saying, hold on, there's something wrong. But this has been going on for quite some time. And that time has also been when we've been looking at recommendation engines specifically. So there's bias in the data. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not the AI algorithm that's the problem. The problem is sitting in the data. And we often forget that. What we've got to start thinking about is that if the input is incorrect or biased, the output is going to be incorrect or biased. And that is critical here. Because what we often focus on is the AI-powered recruiting tool, the chatbot, the AI-powered chatbot. What we forget, it's the data. And if that data is dirty, then we've got a fundamental problem with that. And so the bias in the data and the algorithms is something that we've got to start thinking about from an ethics perspective. And I've got a set of propositions that I'm going to be putting out there, because I think there's some big problems that we can solve almost immediately. But that takes a huge amount of effort. When I say huge, it takes coordination, specifically at an organizational level. So as I think about, any of the AI that's built on the data, there's often this misconception that you often need large amounts of data. And we focus on the size of the data. And that's to some extent correct. You often need at least at a minimum a testing and a training data set, and we can go down, the technical characteristics of the data set. But we often focus on the amount, this large data, in other words, this volume of data that I have. And it always takes me back to the place where I keep thinking that a lot of nothing is still nothing. And for me, that's important, because if you train your AI algorithms on nothing, it will end up with nothing. Or if you train it on what we call dirty data, don't expect a clean outcome. So simple AI techniques using linear models can in some cases approximate the power of experts, some cases. But to effectively leverage AI, current machine learning, remember it's a subset, requires training data sets that are not only labeled, but also sufficiently large and comprehensive. Now, we often like to focus on the large, like I've been saying, but we don't talk about the comprehensiveness. And this is something that I've been often saying, is we like to focus on the output, which is the AI causing a problem or doing something wrong. What we don't like focusing on is that when we fed this AI machine the data, is that we didn't have enough sufficient data, or we didn't have a comprehensive enough set of data to be able to say, these are the possibilities of outcomes. So massive data sets can be difficult to obtain, and each minor variation in an assigned task could require another large set to conduct even more training. Here's an example, and I want to take it away from just, services businesses. Look at this here, teaching autonomous vehicles to navigate a mining site. Whether the weather conditions continually changes will require a data set that encompasses the different environmental conditions the vehicle may encounter. Why do I use that? Because that example for me is the epitome if we think about the self-driving car. Having lots of data to tell what a red robot looks like or a red traffic light and it needs to stop, that's one part of it. But what if there's a slight variation in the red of that traffic light or that robot, depending on which part of the world you sit in? You need to be able to develop that AI algorithm to be able to pick up those small nuances. And therefore, instead of thinking about a big data set, what we've got to start thinking about is a big data set, but also one that is sufficiently comprehensive. In other words, sufficiency. So how big is big? Data set should not be measured just by the amount of data, but rather the sufficiency for the conditions that may arise. And to the point I was making, is if we think about the self-driving car, because I think we all like the self-driving car and everyone can relate directly to the self-driving car. Everyone has heard about it in some shape or form. Many of us may even have been able to test one of those and see how it works. I'm using the example of the different shades at a traffic light. What does red really look like? Having lots of red does not mean that the nuance of the red and the sufficiency of what the car will encounter in the real world is really going to be picked up. And so we've got to start thinking about this, because the comprehensiveness, the sufficiency for the conditions that may arise, for me, is more important than just looking at the large data sets that we often think about. And so we've got to start thinking about this from an ethical perspective, is that prior to the deployment of any of our algorithms, specifically from an AI perspective, under this veil, it will learn. We've got to be clear. As we start deploying it, do we have sufficient data to cover this, or not sufficient data, but do we have enough data to cover all the conditions that may arise. So sufficiency of data, not just the size of data, is important here. And AI as a technology specifically here has often been thought about as being, neutral. We often spoke about this or think about it from a technology neutrality perspective. For the longest time, and this is you and I, we've always assumed that technology is neutral. Sadly, that's not the case. We've seen how technology can be manipulated to take emotional bias with the recent Cambridge Analytica scandal, when personal data of millions of Facebook users was gathered, analyzed, and utilized for political advertising purposes. The fact that it was done is one component. The use of it is another problem. And this here, for me, indicates those blurring of the boundaries on, if I get enough data, what can I do with it? I can do a lot with data. Is this the next, weapon that we can divide societies on? Most definitely. But the point here is that when we can start manipulating people's behaviors, this is when the tough ethical questions should be arising. Cast your mind back to what I said earlier, about 5 or 6 minutes earlier, around the whole premise of a recommendation engine. What is really happening? Feeding it and saying, listen, Manoj, I recommend that you buy X and Y based on your previous history. What if you should rather be showing me much more? Can we start taking, control of that? And the one thing that data doesn't have, and technology to a large extent, is this thing called contextual intelligence. I've got the image here. The name has just escaped me, but it's a robot, which is obviously fashioned like a dog. I think it was called Snap. And what they showed here is that this machine, just to articulate this point, this machine had a single task, was to walk from wherever it was to the door. And when it got to the door, it needed to open the door. Now, let's play this out with an individual or a child. If I ask my kids as an example, my oldest son as an example, or my daughter, or my smallest son, can you please open the door? As they're walking to the door, I can say, don't open the door, stop. And they will probably stop. But what we see from a technology perspective is this robot here had one task and one task only, was to go and open that door. And I urge people to go and Google this and have a look at this video, because the task devotion was really critical, because what it was programmed to do was, regardless of anything, open that door. And what we saw from the developers at the time was that every time they tried to push the door closed, put their foot in the way and stop it, this robot continued and continued and continued. It did not stop, ladies and gentlemen, until it completed the task of opening the door. So what we're seeing here from an ethical perspective is the understanding that, is there a single task devotion that we need to start thinking about? Because when we program these AI machines, as an example of the AI tech using machine learning and deep learning and all of that, is we often focus on a particular outcome or 2 or 3 outcomes, not many more outcomes, but we forget that there's no contextual intelligence. The machine, the technology, will always give you that outcome. And so what do we need to start thinking about? And this is, for me, the crux of this, is what are some of the solutions that we need to use to overcome what we're seeing from an ethics perspective specifically? Now, I've got a few of these propositions. The first problem that we have is in explainability. Even though explainability is not a new problem for artificial intelligence, larger and more complex models, think of the self-driving car as a simple example, make it hard to explain in human terms why a certain decision was reached. And even harder when the decision was reached in near real time. And I use the word near real time. Many of my colleagues say it's real time. I believe even a nanosecond ago was history, but that's inconsequential. The problem is explainability. When you have a self-driving car making a decision on who to bump, as an example, the older person or the toddler, the classic dilemma that often we talk about is, when it makes the decision, is that why has it made the decision, and how do we explain that decision? Because the problem that we're starting to see is that many of us are saying, But listen, I can't explain it. That's only one component. Sorry. We've got to start really starting to think around this whole thing about if the AI makes a decision, turn left or turn right, we should be able to explain why that decision was made. And for me, that's the most critical part here. So what we've got to do is, as a simple solution to the explainability problem, is make explicit the inner workings of the AI algorithms. Tell us how it's coming to a decision. That's the critical part here. And if we look at this here, think of Google. Search results can have dramatic impact on the behavior of its users. What you are fed based on your history. What we need to see is how is it coming up with those search patterns, those recommendations of what I may be looking for. So that for me is the explainability part. The second part about artificial intelligence, which is really now talking to the first point and the misconception that it's going to replace entire jobs. But what we're seeing is that there's no human oversight. So this is what we do. We program something, we implement the machine learning. It's autonomous for the most of the time. It will learn as data comes in and it will make the choices. What we don't remember is that we still need human oversight. So the problem of no human oversight, business efficiency and tailored recommendations, for example, there's no human sitting there and saying, is this actually the right recommendation that I should be pushing out? As an example, one of the big tech companies online, if I went in and bought an urn, and this is, I've seen the meme going around as we call it, but an urn for my dad's ashes or someone's ashes, as an example, is that the next time I log on and look for an urn, or next time I log on to do some shopping, it's going to recommend another urn because I bought it previously. There's no human oversight in that. No AI system should be able to perform its functions without some level of control by humans. In other words, we need to keep monitoring this and keep having a look at what those outcomes are. In this case here, the recommendations. Humans should be directly involved in the decision-making process, or at least have the option to be able to review and override decisions made by an AI model. Think of this. You and I are sitting in a car that's being driven, self-driven. We can sit there. But at any given time, and I know this is built into the self-driving cars, you and I need to have the oversight to be able to stop or change direction instantaneously. We should always have the ability to press stop. The problem that we see is that happens, but there's actually no one there to press the button stop. There's no one there to press connect. There's no one there to pull the power plug out, as an example. And because we're saying this thing looks like it's worked for the first 3 or 4 months, but what are we really doing? We just leave it. And we never intervene. We never go back and check it. There's no monitoring and there's no evaluation at a consistent weekly, monthly, quarterly level from a business perspective. So that's the second problem that we face. The third problem is the one that you and I are fundamentally affected by every day, is demographics. Most AIs developed on loose associations between an individual's demographic characteristics to make behavioral predictions. So based on how I look, where I live as an example, my qualifications as an example, all of a sudden, if we put those 3 together, you may say, Manoj is excellent for whatever thing you want to sell me or offer me. But what we often forget about is this whole notion that demographics are very high-level indicators. But we're trying to say, because I look like this, I sound like that, demographics, and I'm this high and I've got X, Y, and Z characteristics, this is how I'll behave. No. How do we translate from demographic to behavioral is the big concern here. And the solution here is really around AI developers, data scientists. We really need to move away from a bias towards the demographic to the behavioral. I can be educated, living in a poor neighborhood, earning a middle-class income. My neighborhood should not be overweighted as a predictor of my behavior. I may just like my hometown. My family is there. My friends are there. Maybe I just don't want to move out of there. Why should I be penalized for where I live? A demographic characteristic that does not fundamentally say to me that I will behave in a certain way. Many will argue, but Manoj, many criminals come from an area as an example. That for me is what we call a spurious correlation. Living in an area does not mean I will be a criminal, as an example. And these are some of the tough discussions that we need to have. From an ethics perspective, let's be very clear. Criminal justice systems, that's what some of the AI has told us. The fact of the matter is, because I live in an area, even though I was fast asleep and have done nothing, the reality is that I may have a higher propensity to have been guilty just because I live in an area. Now you can hear from my side, it pains me that we do that. It pains me, regardless of what we say, there's a high relationship. My statistics colleagues will tell me, Manoj, there's a significant correlation. The fact that there's a significant correlation, there's a good association, does not mean it's true. And for me, that's the point that we miss from a demographics perspective, is that we use demographics to try and understand behavior. Two fundamentally different data points. So that's number 3. Number 4, data governance. Now, data governance is not at the core of strategy and operations for the most part. Many organizations are going down the route of master data management specifically, but what we're not seeing is the rise in the inclusion of data governance as part of a core strategy and operations. And if your organization is doing it, I think you're probably 2 years ahead of many organizations. My sense of the market and what I've seen specifically is that there is not proper data governance that's going on, and it's not part of the strategy. It remains a program that sits somewhere. In other words, it's not being elevated outside of its operational focus. It's not being elevated to be a strategic lever to pull. And this is where I say there is a cost associated with it, both financial and non-financial. But the solution to the lack of data governance is really the establishment of governance boards that convenes, approves, and discusses things like privacy, cybersecurity, compliance, and other data-related risks. What are other data-related risks? Are the inputs that we're giving, the data that we're feeding our AI machines or our AI algorithms, is there any bias in that data? Have we tested for that bias? How have we mitigated against that bias, as an example? So a data and AI ethics strategy needs to dovetail with the general data and AI strategy of an organization. This is a critical function in an organization now. And this, for me, is where the cost of coordination comes in. That's the real cost of getting people around, but also holding individuals accountable. I call this a governance board. Many organizations will argue with me, Manoj, we've got a governance board that sits at the board level. I'm not saying that. I want a governance board internally, sitting at the executive level, that almost takes an outside-in view. This board must have the following involved: those in cyber, risk, compliance, privacy, and analytics. And for me, where all of this has really worked, so where I've looked at this and studied data governance from a governance board perspective, we have seen it's most effective is when there's external subject matter experts that are brought in. As an example, I sit on a governance board. The value that I bring is that I'm not tied to the organization. I don't come from a mindset of what the organization is. I've got a broader view of it, as an example. That broader view allows me to challenge what the organization sees. Not because I want to challenge it, but because I want to make sure that if I'm part of a governance board and the ethics are a problem, I want to understand, how did you build that algorithm? What are those data sources, as an example, that went in? Because garbage in will always equal garbage out, regardless of what we say. And the last point here specifically is the problem of an AI ethical framework. Now, many of you may have been hearing this for the first time, is that often in our organizations, we just don't have an ethical framework. Never mind just an AI ethical framework, but a general ethical framework. What are some of the core values, and how do we make sure that we always are part of those values or implementing those values? I hear about the values of organizations, transparency, yet there's a lot that's a secret. I've asked for X, I'll never get it. We talk about transparency very glibly. We talk about our organization's values very glibly in many instances. Do we live those values? And why am I talking about values? Because an ethical framework should be a guiding path for us specifically. And so a framework that really articulates what are our ethical standards. And those ethical standards must be relevant internally and externally. So who are those stakeholders that are going to be affected? What is that governance structure? And then how do we measure, are we achieving what we want to achieve based on our ethical framework? Much more difficult to put KPIs there, but easier to articulate what our ethical standards are. But these ethical standards are not just for people who interact with our external stakeholders. It's not only for our managers that are interacting and leading teams, as an example. What it's really about is it should include ethical standards for people that collect data as well. Think of your warehouse. What are the ethical standards that can include them? Product developers as well. What is the ethical framework within which you are operating? Product managers and product owners as well. So the point here is that an AI ethical framework, never mind it never and not existing, needs to fundamentally exist. We need to be able to measure it, but we need to apply it across the entire value chain. And then we've got to be able to say we have achieved this or not. And so it really becomes a critical function that needs to take place. And why does it become a critical function? Is as AI allows our organizations to scale products and services more easily and quickly, as an example, what we need to understand, so does the legal, risk, and compliance problems. They also get scaled and amplified up. So how do you vet for biased algorithms? How do you start treating privacy violations? And then this governance or this AI ethical framework must look at unexplainable outputs. How do you deal with it? We can't just blame the AI. We can't just blame the developer. We've got to take a more holistic approach to this problem of the AI ethical framework. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm just going to go back to this slide as my holding slide, but what the key points here is that if I think back to where I started, and I'm just going to wrap this up quickly, is that I said we're in the fourth industrial revolution. We agree we're in the fourth industrial revolution, some of us in the fifth industrial revolution. What have we learned about the first, second, and third industrial revolutions? Is that we've got to elevate and bring ethics up front and not leaving it lagging behind. It's not an afterthought. We've got to start being proactive about it. I've shown you and I've given you some examples specifically around organizations, big tech organizations with massive budgets. They can do whatever they want, pockets are deep, that have got it wrong. And we've got to learn from those examples. But what we've got to learn from an ethical perspective is how do you and I start taking accountability, number one, and responsibility, number two. The problems that I've positioned to you, lack of explainability, the biggest ethical issue that we face. What is the solution to that? Make explicit the inner workings of your AI algorithms. Remember, organization, we don't compete on algorithms for competitive advantage. We compete on a product or service, depending on B2B, B2C, whatever it may be. We compete on that. This gives us a competitive advantage, but you've got to be able to be clear and explicit of how it works. The second problem that I positioned to you today was that there's no human oversight. Simple. No AI system should be able to perform functions without some level of control by a human. The third is, what do we actually feed into our AI algorithms here? The solution is all the developers, data scientists. We've got to move away from demographics. If we want to make behavioral predictions, we've got to incorporate behavioral data. Number four that I spoke about, data governance. Set up the data governance board. Yes, there's a cost associated with coordination, getting the right people around, but it's worthwhile if you think about the reputational risk from AI going wrong, which is high, ladies and gentlemen, very high. Why is it high? Because of the data based on our historical patterns. And number five, really around the AI ethical framework. How do we start thinking about creating an artificial intelligence ethical framework for our organizations? And I often argue, start with an organizational ethical framework. What are those core principles? And then leverage that for your artificial intelligence. And with that, I hope I've given you some thinking points, but really some guidance on being able to say, how do we start going through this, Vinny? How do we start thinking about ethics differently? Let's elevate it and bring it to the front of the queue instead of leaving it lagging behind as we did in the first, second, and third industrial revolutions.
Thank you, Manoj. Thank you very much for your time and for all the points. we do have time for a couple of questions, don't we?
Yeah.
One, I have a couple of from the web, but I also have one particularly from a layman as myself. I always like it when you use the examples and all that. But one thought: do we have the foundation? Do we have the frameworks? Do we have all of this? If we take AI out of the acquisition, do we already have all what we are looking for? And AI is just adding. You see my point there?
Yeah. So I think, Sven, what a brilliant question, and I must thank you for that, because we do have ethical frameworks. We have them in organizations. It's the problem of making sure when you onboard people that we actually make them aware of those frameworks. We often talk about the strategy, but we never tell people about our ethical framework. What are the principles within which we all operate, and how do we operate within them? That's the first point. So there is a foundation, but that foundation is often hidden somewhere. It's not brought front and center. And then to your point is, how do we just tag on and level up with AI? My concern from my work is that the frameworks for ethics exist, but they're hidden somewhere.
Yeah.
But to dust them off, make them explicit, and then add the AI component on top.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me run a couple of questions from the web. How do you operationalize AI ethics?
So I think for me, the two most important points is the data governance that you must have as core to your strategy. And for me, the governance board, I think operationally, it's easy to operationalize this. You've got to staff it with the right people. Who are those right people? People that come from the cyber space in your organization, cybersecurity. Number 2 is risk and compliance. Number 3, privacy. And number 2, generally organizations put risk and compliance together, whether it's a single person or but a representative from risk, compliance, and privacy as well. So cybersecurity, privacy, risk compliance, and analytics. Analytics is often left away from that big board level. It's often seen as, it happens somewhere, it's part of IT, cool, at best case. And then, an external subject matter expert who says, I'm going to challenge you on your data governance. The governance board is not just a board level, but an executive level accountability structure that fundamentally and practically can be put into place. Sven, you and I could do that tomorrow for APIS, right? We could put this together. It's not a major thing. It's just about staffing it with the right people. I've said we've got the ingredients to build the cake. Can we just put the ingredients together now? To your question about the framework. Yeah, it's there. We've got to do it. And I urge organizations to do it quicker, sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. But listen, we often talk about what organizations can do. But what should they not do?
Number one, they should not let the AI algorithms operate independently. That's the first point. There has to be human intervention. We've got to stop thinking about this thing called big data in terms of how much data I have, but rather start thinking about the sufficiency of the data for the conditions that I can reasonably be able to understand exist. A good example of that sufficiency of data. None of us could have predicted the outbreak of a pandemic. People have said that if they could and they did and all of that, but the reality is that none of us can, with a high level of certainty, predict this outlying event. We must be very clear, is that the sufficiency of data says that even though there's a small probability of occurrence, it does not mean that it is impossible. The impossibility is what you and I have in our minds. We think a global pandemic prior to COVID-19 is an impossible event. No, it wasn't. It was simply a highly improbable. So the question that I often say, or the answer to a question like that, Sven, is quite simply, how do we make sure that if this is the spectrum of events that may occur, how do we make sure that we've got enough data to be able to account for that? And if we don't have data to account for a small part there, but we keep that at the top of our minds all the time. That's what we shouldn't, that's what we do. So don't, make sure it's not just about large amounts of data. It's also about sufficiency. That's number one. Number two is really around the stuff that we should not be doing is letting AI algorithms operate by themselves. We can see this. Machines and computers and any technology is task orientated. What's the job of the internet? To connect us. Let's be clear. We use it for different forms, but it's to connect us. It's there for a very specific reason. And I think we mustn't forget that. So what we should not do is quite simply let this thing happen by itself. We need to be able to say, you and I, Sven, are going to take accountability and responsibility.
Thank you, Manoj. And just to your point about the demographical issues as well, I just have to compliment on that, because that it also shows that within us there is a capability of doing the unexpected and actually change the outcome, not depending on any statistics or whatever that's implicated in that. So I really like that portion of your presentation. Thank you very much. Listen, yes.
Can I just say one point around
yes,
that? Because
please.
I think we have the opportunity to change the future.
Yeah.
If we think differently, even if we just use the demographics as an example, it's in our hands, and we must take advantage of that.
And we have to use it ourselves. Absolutely. This is part of a series of 3 webinars. We already done one, and for those who came on late, all of the webinars will be available on YouTube on the APIS Training channel. We will have a third one. It will be after the summer in September. Manoj, can you please just give a teaser on the topic you want to cover in that third and final webinar?
Yeah, so what we'll talk about is the disruptive nature of artificial intelligence across the value chain. And how does this amplify and be the fuel for disruption? I'm a massive fan of not using the word disruption. I'd rather talk about disintermediation. I think it's a better English word. But the role that AI as the fuel to disintermediation and disruption is what we'll talk about in that webinar.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And thank you for those who has been watching. And as always, visit us on apistraining.com for more information, and you can find this webinar and other webinars at our YouTube channel. Thank you. Goodbye.